You can stop me at any time. Feel free, unmute, ask a question. But I also am kind of planning to do a little Q&A at the end. So if you do want to hold it, that's fine as well. So this is just a little overview of the history of why or how we've gotten to continuous innovation. You can see these little this orange text explaining really how we go about building products. Back in the Toyota manufacturing days, it was all about efficiency on the floor. Then it turned into sending products in boxes to people. And you had to plan it out to a T and then send it and hoped it all worked. And then we entered the computer age and iterative process began. The agile process was really adopted by development teams, a lot in product teams. And today we are at continuous innovation. And lean startup is really what started that about 10 years ago. And continuous innovation is the framework, the end-to-end framework for lean startup. If you read the book Lean Startup or any of Ash Maurya's material, Running Lean, Scaling Lean, a lot of those are focused on creating guides for how to validate ideas. Continuous innovation goes beyond it. It's how to really generate those ideas and then how to take them end to end and start iterating them even through scale. So that's kind of what continuous innovation is. The reason that we need this is because customers today have more choice than ever before. And they can get and find anything they want. And the only way to succeed is to engage your customers continuously. Excuse the pun. To give a little bit more detail here, you can kind of understand it through this visualization. The old waterfall approach, you set the requirements here, then you build for a long time, then you release and you hopefully get market validation. Agile, a little bit more release friendly in that you're releasing constantly and you occasionally get market validation after a couple releases, after a full product is put out there. Lean startup and continuous innovation specifically is more about build in very short increments, release very quickly, and get market validation as quickly as possible. And we're going to see what that means, but in essence, it combines the build cycle with the business cycle. And we don't want to just focus on build velocity, we want to focus on traction velocity and getting customers to buy in as early as possible. The reason for the need for this and the backdrop of it is that we're currently going through a global entrepreneurial renaissance. We can build anything we want these days. There are 100 million startups created every year. That is 3 startups every second. Half of the Fortune 500 companies in the world have gone out of business in the last 15 years. And if you're just looking at the logos for these companies, you might find a common thread between them. They were not willing to attempt something new. They only had one idea and they were going to execute on that one business model, that one idea. And really the best way to find the next big idea is to be continuously testing lots of ideas. Just some quotes from some of the top tech companies in the world that kind of reinforce this. Jeff Bezos, our success is a function of how many experiments we do per year, per month, per week, per day. Facebook, same thing. There's never just one version of Facebook running, right? There's 10,000. The product managers in the room know about this and why this is the case. But the number of experiments that you run per year, and you can see the companies that run lots of experiments per year, is directly tied to your success and your ability to saturate the market with good ideas. So the common thread between all of those companies, just to go back, all of these companies that are running all these experiments, is that the new competitive advantage today is not can we build it and building things as quickly as possible. It's speed of learning. And that's what these companies do so well. They outlearn their competition. So the question then is, well, okay, why isn't everybody just doing this then? The problem is that even though product and development teams have been using agile methods for a long time, those product and development teams are limited by what they're allowed to do, by the business model they are working on. Business planning to create new business models is stuck back in the old world of this staged, planned, go execute on this one idea until you make it work mindset. And that old business planning is where the problem is. And therefore, we need to reset our minds around what is a business model? What is an idea? How much do you have to know about something to get started on working on an idea and creating new products? You might find this a little familiar when you say to your boss, your superior, I have a promising new idea. And they say, well, okay, give me a business plan. Show me a financial forecast. Show me a product roadmap. All of these things are very much unknown. The number 2 killer of ideas is that they never get started because you don't want to do a business plan, a financial forecast, and a product roadmap because they're all just guesswork anyway. I'll show you the number 1 idea in just a little bit. The other part of this, well, if all you're trying to do is say, we're executing on a plan, we're on track, what we said we were going to do 3 months ago, we're doing that, we're building the right things, and we're within budget, and you're getting feedback saying, all right, good job, right? You're on the right track. But is building a product that nobody wants, but it's on time and within budget, is that progress? If you do it this way and you're only executing on a plan, then you can only execute on a few big ideas at any given time. And that conflicts with the idea of you need to test lots of things at any given time. These sorts of processes of show me the plan, show me the business plan, the financial forecasts, the product roadmap, these artifacts and ways of doing business were not built for the modern day. They were not built for continuously engaging customers. The old world, business plan. The new world, business model. And you're going to see this little icon a lot. This is kind of just the logo for a lean canvas, which is essentially a one-page diagram, right? It's not 40 pages. It's something that people can easily understand, whereas a business plan is something nobody's ever going to read. When there's lots of uncertainty at the beginning of your business, at the beginning of a product idea, you have no idea what's actually going to happen. You need a dynamic model. You don't need a long-winded business plan with lots of guesswork in it that probably is not going to be true. So I want to introduce to you the entrepreneurial method, and this is kind of the core of continuous innovation. Just like scientists have their own ways of modeling the natural world, we have a way of modeling a static moment in time of a certain market that we believe will act in a certain way. And that's what this is. You're starting with a business model. And that business model looks like this, the lean canvas. The guy who created continuous innovation, Ash Maurya, he created the lean canvas as well. Actually, I'm kind of curious. Has anybody here used the lean canvas themselves, either in a project or when developing new products? Just come off mute if you have. I'm curious.
Yeah, I built one the other day after our conversation.
Okay. Ian has, okay. All right. Well, we're going to get to know this in the second meetup. We're actually going to we're going to focus on how to create these in a way to communicate your idea and to get buy-in. So, number 1, needing to understand is that the first mindset to understand. We're going to go through a few of these mindsets. Is that the business model is the product. The product is not the product. The business model is the product. And as soon as you have a model, the second part of the entrepreneurial method is to identify the risks, right? Prioritize. When you're prioritizing risks, you're looking at your model and you're asking yourselves, what, if it were not true, which of these assumptions, if it were not true, would cause total business model failure? Is it the pricing? Is it the customer segment? Is it their problem? Is it the value proposition? Is it our solution description? Which part of this is the riskiest thing? And usually with most products that are not super high tech, usually it's desirability. It's the customer and their problem and the value proposition, certainly. It's kind of all part of it. And that's usually where you focus on most new products and new businesses. So you want to tackle your riskiest assumptions first. As I mentioned, this is usually the area that we start in, the desirability part of it. The viability part, will they pay for it? Can we make money off of this? That certainly comes very much in a close second. But you need to first nail the problem and the customer before you can move on. Excuse me. Can we build it is usually not part of the early considerations unless you are building either a non-tech product that requires lots of stakeholders, a complex system, and lots of moving parts, or it's some sort of very high-tech product using artificial intelligence, perhaps, something that hasn't been done before. So most people are starting this desirability part when they're prioritizing their business model and what to work on. The problem is that a lot of people often look at the business model and they focus on this one box. I'm just going to go back to it. This one box right here, the solution, right? This is where you just write down what the thing is that you have in your mind. And people focus on it so much that it really affects the rest of this canvas. And we call this the innovator's bias. And this is one thing that we need to get away from, and we need to focus on the customer and the solution. I know that empathy is something that everybody in this room has probably heard as the number one best characteristic to have when you're building a new product or you're starting a new business. Empathy for the people that you're building it for. Your solution is your perspective on one possible way to solve their problem, but you need to deeply understand how they're solving their problems right now and focus on understanding what value you can provide before you bother to define a solution. So as I mentioned, we were going to get to this. The number one reason products fail is that we waste time building the wrong product. And that's, again, directly tied to the innovator's bias. You feel that your ideas is what people need and want. Starting with your idea, or specifically your solution, is like building a key without a door. It is okay to have solutions that you can have in mind. I mean, R&D departments come up with new technologies, new solutions all the time. And they say, well, what do we do with this? But in those situations, those companies usually recognize that much of their R&D is being produced and then is just left on a shelf. So having a team that really understands, well, what is the value that this solution is proposing, and then going back to square one and starting with the customer and their problem is usually what happens and needs to happen in those situations. More on the key and door metaphor, of course, right? You want to focus on the problems worth solving, not on the solution you have in your mind. And usually the problems we're solving, that you have to focus on these outside boxes. So when you're first starting with your first business model, you lay it out, you fill in all the boxes, but really you're mostly focused on these outer boxes. And we usually call that the leaner canvas. You can almost just strip everything else away and just have those two and call it the leaner canvas and start from there. So love the problem, not your solution. That's the third mindset here. Okay, so now we're going to start to actually get into a view of what some of the tools are in the continuous innovation framework. The third part of the entrepreneurial method, after you model your idea, after you prioritize the risks, then we're going to test, right? We need to test a hypothesis that you make based on those prioritizations, all right? And the thing that ties all of this together is called the lean sprint. A lean sprint, it is a time-boxed iteration cycle for sourcing, ranking, and testing new ideas. You might recognize this. This is the experiment loop, the build, measure, learn loop. This is often not enough. A lot of product teams do this, or at least do this at a surface level, but the biggest part that is forgotten, or at least not understood well, is the learn and come up with new ideas part. This is often skipped over, and we simply measure it and we say it worked or it didn't work. But learning from that and understanding where to go with that and how to find the next good idea from it is the key to actually running good sprints and progressively iterating towards products that people want. This is just a little visualization of what a lean sprint kind of looks like. You can see here at the bottom, model, prioritize, test, the entrepreneurial method. You model your new business idea or your new product. These are a few of the tools that we use to model them in the continuous innovation framework. You obviously recognize the lean canvas now, but you might not recognize the traction model. We're going to see that in just a little bit. But then you also have metrics. And this is an icon for metrics that we can talk about later, is the customer factory. But these are just 3 lightweight, one-page tools for modeling your idea. Prioritizing the risks in your model now. That's what once we get to the prioritization stage, we start creating plans. We create a rollout plan and a validation plan. From these plans, we have ideas on how to address this risk. We have 3 different ideas here. And 3 different, in your team, if you have a team of 5 people, for example, everybody should be coming to the table with ideas on what to do. We're going to talk a little bit about the lean sprints a little bit later in this talk, about how to make it a merit-based, best idea wins out environment, because that's key to having a good team in general, but also to running lean sprints and making sure the best ideas rise to the top. So after you model your idea, after you create a plan based on your prioritized list of risks, then you start testing. You run experiments. You build, you measure, you learn. Usually these experiments run about 2 weeks. And usually the lean sprint itself overall runs, it varies from team to team, but usually 2 to 3 weeks. It depends on what you're doing in the sprint. It depends on what your hypothesis is. Are you going for learning or are you going for traction? Those are really the only 2 types of sprints: a learning sprint, a traction sprint. Sometimes you need to go out and do customer discovery for 2 weeks, and that's what your sprint is about. Sometimes from that learning, you've decided, okay, we have an insight. We believe that if we do X, then we will get Y as traction. Then you run a traction sprint. So those 2 types of sprints go hand in hand. They're constantly going back and forth between each other, learning and traction. And at the end of the sprint, this is the important part. At the end of the sprint, all of the team looks as objectively as they can at the results based on the hypothesis. If you said, for example, during a learning sprint, if your hypothesis at the beginning was, if we reach out to 100 sales managers at manufacturing companies, then we are going to get 15 interviews and we are going to learn X, Y, and Z. At the end of that sprint, you say, well, we reached out to 50. We talked to 3. We only learned this. Even that is helpful because you can objectively, out loud, say to your team, we did not reach what we thought we would. Why didn't we? Let's talk about it and reassess and go back to the beginning and say, well, what are our new risks? Do we have new risks? If you don't have new risks and you still haven't achieved the learning or the traction that you set out to, then maybe you just reframe the hypothesis, you reframe the sprint for what you're going to do next. In a traction sprint, you might be saying, well, we've learned a lot. We've learned that, for example, if I'm writing a book, I've done 100 interviews with people about this book, and I believe that I have a good book idea. So in this sprint, I'm going to say, if I write a 2-chapter book and I release it on a blog with a link that says, sign up here if you want to purchase this book, the rest of this book, then I will get a certain number of people to sign up, or a certain percentage of people to sign up based on how many I sent it out to. So in that situation, you're setting a more traction-based goal, right? And we're going to talk about traction in a little bit, but running these sprints and doing effective experiments is really all about having the team being as objective as they can in analyzing the results and coming up with new hypotheses to break the constraint that we have in our business model. And we'll talk about that in a little bit too. So we have to ask ourselves, if let me just go back, if the key to running good sprints is to come up with good ideas at the end of each sprint, then we have to say, where do good ideas come from? And this is something that really, regardless of what team you're on, if you want to come up with good ideas, you need to adopt a diverge, converge way of working and a way of team working, really. If you understand, or when you understand the problem, if you say, well, I'm building, or we have this idea for product X, and we've modeled it out. Here's a one-page, lean canvas, and we believe that the biggest problem, the biggest risk, the thing that if it were wrong, the whole business model is a failure, is that we think that they have this problem, and we need to go validate that. Right? As soon as you have that constraint agreed upon with your team, you need to allow the team to go off on their own, solo, come up with choices, come back, present their choices. Everybody gets a voice. There is no hippo, highest paid person's opinion. There is no group think. There is no just brainstorming out loud where the loudest person wins out and the introverts don't say anything. You need time to diverge before you converge. Everybody says what they think what they think would be best to break that constraint, and then you choose one in a merit-based way. Sometimes you have to vote on it, but usually the best ideas simply rise to the top during these discussions. Here's a wider vision of how this sprint could work, right? You baseline you baseline where you're at with your business model. That's all that means. This is a little bit later stage, so excuse some of the wording. But you identify the problem or the constraint. You diverge, come up with choices and ideas for how to break that constraint. You come back together, you present your choices. Everybody says, well, I think I like that idea, right? Everybody just kind of generally agrees, we think that idea is best. We kind of refine it based on everybody else's suggestions. You said, okay, let's form a hypothesis around this idea and then go off and test it. You diverge again, you do your tests, and then you converge with your results and suggestions for your next actions. It is very important to have diverge, converge in terms of decision choices and then decision choosing. So that is really where the best ideas come from, is simply from allowing everybody to have a voice and making it clear to everybody that they're expected to come to the table with their thinking. Here's an even larger picture. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through all of this, but you can kind of just see this is a 2-week sprint, Monday through Friday, Monday through Friday. You expose problems on the first day. Here are your business models. Remember, your canvas, your traction roadmap, your metrics. You say, well, the problem is here. Or if you have a later stage product, maybe you say, well, acquisition is our biggest constraint, and the problem is there. And everybody says, okay, we have aligned on the constraint on the business model. Now everybody comes to the table with ideas. In this team, you might have 5 people and they had 5 ideas. During that sprint kickoff meeting, maybe you say, well, these 3 ideas, we're not going to do them. But you know what? These 2 ideas, and remember, an idea is a suggestion for how to break the constraint, the biggest constraint on your model. And you might say, well, we're going to go off and do 3 different experiments based on these 2 ideas. And you can see there's a build, measure, learn loop going through these 2 weeks. Some of these experiments are faster on the build phase. Some of them take less time to build. For example, if you're just going to interview people, if you're just doing a learning sprint, then you don't have much to build. You have to build an interview script, and certainly you have to go find people to talk to. But that doesn't take too long. Whereas if you're testing that, for example, that 2-chapter book preview idea that I just kind of mentioned, well, you have to go write 2 chapters of a book, unless you already have them, of course. But you can see how the build part of these experiments might take short time, might take a long time. And the length of your sprint might have to elongate or it can shorten, depending on what you need to build before you actually go measure and learn from it. And at the end of this sprint, well, either you validated your hypothesis, you proved it right, or you didn't, for example, with this one. And at the end, again, everybody comes back to the table saying, here's my idea for how to break the next constraint, right? And then you start the process again. So that was kind of a high level view of the sprint. Again, feel free to ask questions as we go here, but hold them till the end as well is fine too.
Actually, I do have a question.
Go ahead.
Um, I feel like my brain has gotten a little bit twisted up when you say break the constraint. Would you mind,
Yes.
I don't know, maybe giving
Yeah.
some examples of
Yeah.
exactly what you mean by that?
There's two different phases of a product. One is where you are in the early learning stage where your business model itself is just new and there's tons of unknowns. You don't know if that customer segment is the customer segment that will become your customer. You don't know if the problem that they have is the problem is well stated. You don't know if your value proposition is clear. You don't know if they're going to pay for it. So there's lots of uncertainty in the early stages of a business model. And in this phase, we don't say break constraints. We say de-risk or or prove assumptions right. Okay. So we're not talking about constraints yet because we don't have any metrics yet. We're just in this early phase of a guesswork. Okay, so early on, you're not saying break constraints, and I'm glad that you asked this because that was confusing. That was very confusing for me early on too. Early on, it's all about proving assumptions or disproving them and having to change those assumptions. So you don't use the word constraint. But once you prove this business model, or once you validate this business model through learning and some early traction experiments, then you start to actually create an MVP. Then you start to have metrics. And with those metrics, that's where you can start to look objectively at your macro level metrics, right? Acquisition, activation, retention, referral, revenue. And you start to say, where is the bottleneck? Where is the constraint? Okay, so it's once you start getting, once you have a metrics culture adopted, that's where you start to use the language of what's the constraint instead of what's the biggest assumption. Did that make sense, Miranda?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Okay, we'll look a little bit more at that in a second as well, talking about constraints. And yes, I
And
know.
I would also like to hear some concrete examples, as we go. It helps me,
Sure, sure,
engage.
sure. Let's talk. In that case, let's talk a little bit more. Let's expand on this in the Q&A right after this, because I think that's a great topic to talk about. So, so I can see that the word constraint is going to be a little confusing, or perhaps might be confusing. But this should hopefully help you understand a little bit when you are prioritizing what to work on in your sprint, meaning prioritizing ideas, really. You have to prioritize, well, what is the biggest constraint that we need to break right now? And in order to even prioritize a constraint, you first need metrics. And to add to this, based on the questions that just came up, in order, really, in order to have metrics, you need a working product. So this is really, it doesn't have to be the MVP stage, but usually this comes into this, we start talking about constraints and we start having a metrics culture once we have a working product where we're starting to measure how many people are coming in, how many people are doing a certain thing to activate themselves, signing up, doing one of your first value activities, and then retaining, then paying, and referring friends. That's where we start to measure and we can start to talk numbers very specifically. Early on, it's hard to say constraints. Early on, it's just, what's the biggest assumption here? What's the biggest risk? That's the phrasing and the wording that you're using in an early business model that you haven't even built anything for yet. So yeah, let's talk a little bit more about that at the end. So, but I do want to say that you want to put in a metrics culture as early as humanly possible, because per this quote, running a business without metrics is like flying a plane without instruments. And so as soon as you can, start putting any metrics down on paper. You want to do that. You can do metrics without having a working product. So I should say that right now. You can just you could just do a weekly spreadsheet where you're counting the number of emails you've sent, the number of replies you've gotten. For example, if you're writing that book, I'm going to use that example a little bit more. If I'm writing a book and I say, well, I'm going to email 100 people in a certain Facebook group that is a certain category, that has a certain type of customer, a certain type of person in it that I think would like this book. And I'm going to message 100 of them on Facebook this week. And we're going to see how many, first of all, reply to me in interest. And second of all, how many actually click the link to go to my first 2 chapters of my book. And then third of all, sign up to be a future paying customer to get the rest of the book when it's ready. And you might be thinking, well, they're not actually paying, but that is an indication that they will pay. So through all of this, you can see there are metrics. They're not in a product anywhere. They're not in a, they're not being recorded in some database, but you can start writing them down yourself. And as soon as you can start doing that, you're going to start seeing the constraints before you even have a working product. And you can start to say, well, 100 people goes down to 15 people in step 2, goes down to 5 people in step 3, goes down to 0 in perhaps some future step. And you need to look at that during the beginning of your sprints and you say, where is the constraint, right? And maybe you can even ask yourself, well, what's the biggest risk as well? The constraints and risks, they can get a little blurry when you start actually acting on the things that you've learned in the early stage discovery, and you start actually doing traction experiments. There can still be wrong assumptions in your business model, and there can be constraints on getting people to traction with the offering that you're currently making. So you do have to, kind of go back and forth between them sometimes, but that is up to you and your team when you're objectively looking at the results of your sprint, at the metrics of what you've been doing and your business model, and you say, what should we work on? What do we prioritize? Is there an assumption that's wrong, or is it just constraint on it, or are our assumptions correct? And we just need to figure out why people aren't clicking that last button. But it might be one of your assumptions. So we'll talk more. When you're doing when you're in the early phases of a metrics culture, you really want to focus on the macro stuff. As I mentioned, 100 people, where I send 100 messages, 15 reply, 5 click the second book, maybe 1 actually does something else that I don't know, and it's just a hypothetical business model. Those are macro metrics, acquisition, activation, revenue. You can get micro. You can sign up for any number of metrics dashboards. You can obviously put in Google Analytics on a website that you're running. You can be looking at where the geography is of people coming in, what time of day. But early on, and for the sake of high level alignment on your team, you really should focus on simple macro metrics. And we're going to kind of, actually, I don't know if we'll, oh yeah, right here. Here's an example of kind of a macro metrics, a lightweight metrics board. So this is that logo for the metrics that you saw before. Shout out anybody, have you seen this thing before? Just let me know if you've seen it. Okay. This is the customer factory. That's what this is. And these 5 metrics are the pirate metrics: acquisition, activation, retention, referral, revenue. Are pirate metrics, okay? It's simple, it's macro, it's high level. Here's an example. Here is, let's see, what was this for? What business was this for? I can't recall what business model this was actually for, but if you just look at it, you don't even really need to know what the product was, but you can understand these macro level metrics, right? This person created some sort of website apparently, and they got 65 visitors every week, and weekly cohorts are good to look at. And within that, from those 65 visitors, they got 30 people that actually signed up. And then 10 of those 30 actually scheduled an interview. And then 1 of those 10 signed up for a trial. 6 of them actually we got 6 people coming in from referrals. And then this last part, the revenue, there is no data yet because this person hasn't actually created a working revenue-based business model. But it's the beginning of a repeatable business model. This person is clearly trying to get people to go from trial to a paid customer. Okay, so this is just an example of, again, a lightweight metrics dashboard. And this is something that you can look at and say, where is the constraint? So as I mentioned, every business model is a system of interconnected processes, and there's one constraint, and this is known as the theory of constraints. Yes, there are many things that could be worked on in a business model, right? You can work on the acquisition. You say, well, not enough people are coming in. You can work on the revenue side. Well, not enough people are clicking that revenue button, right? You can work on the retention piece. Not enough people are coming back every week. But the theory of constraints tells us there is only one thing that is actually the bottleneck for this business model. If you look at this, only one of these places is the true bottleneck. And that's what you're doing with your team at the beginning of the sprint and during the sprint kickoff. You are agreeing, where is the constraint here? And then everybody goes away, comes up with ideas on how to break that constraint. And then you come back and you decide what you're going to work on. If your team decides, well, let's see, we got, almost half the people that are coming in are actually signing up. About a third of those people are scheduling an interview. And about 10% of them are actually signing up for a trial, and then 0% are actually signing up for a paid whatever this is. I'm curious, for the people in the room here, where do you think the constraint is in this metrics dashboard? Go ahead, shout it out if you got an idea.
I see the biggest constraint is getting from the trial to the sale.
I agree.
But maybe you don't, because you don't have any sale data, you don't have the data yet to figure out where the constraint is on that.
Yeah.
So the next constraint would be, you've only got, you go from 50% down to 33% down to 10%. Well, the 10% is your bottleneck. So that's where you would focus.
Yeah. Yeah, and truth to tell, we don't really know, does this person have, is this 0, or is this just an early metrics dashboard and they just don't know yet, if this one person is even going to sign up. So you're right, we don't have enough information, but you are reading it correctly. And usually when you're looking at your metrics, if you're kind of looking and you're saying, well, I don't know, what is the constraint? You normally want to start near the end, because if you try to optimize, let's pretend the number of visitors coming in. If you're trying to optimize this and say, hey, all we need is more people coming in. All we need is to get to 1,000 visitors a week. Well, then what happens here at the end? You put in all this effort. Maybe you do a big marketing campaign. Maybe your next sprint is completely focused on writing blog posts, creating videos, going to social media, promoting. Well, what happens here at the end? Maybe it's still 0, right? So usually when you're looking at the biggest constraint, you want to start near the end and make sure that you're make sure that the rate of people that are paying, or the rate of people that are signing up for the trial even, that is optimized to a level that you're satisfied with before you go earlier in the funnel. It's just work, effort, and efficiency at that point. Okay, so I just wanted to, make sure we understood that there really is just one thing that your team needs to align on at the beginning of the sprint. Yes, you can have people doing other things in a sprint, especially if you're starting a new business. There's lots of things to do. So keep in mind the 80-20 rule. 80% of your team's time should be focused on breaking this one single constraint in your business model. The other 20% of the time, fair enough. You need to do what you need to do. Sometimes you got lawyers you need to deal with. Sometimes you got accounts you need to set up. Sometimes you have existing clients that you need to work with, okay? But your team really needs to focus on breaking the constraints in the business model. And if you haven't seen this quote, now you have. Great quote. In God we trust, all others bring data. And that really just ties back to make sure that you have a metrics culture and that you're making evidence-based decisions. And as you can see with some of these examples that I've described, as well as this example that we're kind of looking at here, this is not a working digital product right here. Okay, you can have a metrics culture early without having a real product. The old way of doing things, the staged approach, the waterfall approach, even the agile approach, it's focused on output, build velocity. The new way of doing things is based on outcome. So we have to ask ourselves, well, what is outcome? What is the goal that we should be focused on during any sprint? When you are, and I know Ian, this will be true for you as well, when you are trying to get investors interested, when you are trying to get the VP of product interested in your idea, when you're trying to explain the progress that you've made to key stakeholders or to strategic partners, what is the thing that matters to all of them? Ian, I'm going to ask you this actually. I don't know if we talked about it. What do you think it is? Or I don't know, you might not even be here still. He said he had to leave. Yeah, he had to leave. Don't worry about it. I was going to quiz him. The thing that everybody cares about, traction, right? Traction needs to be the goal that we set for our business models. And you need to understand, what are we measuring with traction? It's not always revenue. It doesn't have to be. A lot of people use revenue, but revenue is a lagging indicator. Revenue happens as a result of other things, of leading indicators. Customer engagement with your product is probably the best way of showing traction for early products. You don't necessarily have to have revenue, but revenue is one way of showing traction. It's true. I just want to show this slide real quick because profit, obviously, you won't be profitable for a long time with a new product or a new business model, right? You're going to be losing money, certainly. You could be making revenue at some point, right? People will actually start paying you at some point. But traction is the leading indicator, the leading metric that leads to that revenue, right? It is the measure of a working business model. With the book sign up thing, the traction was people signing up, leaving their email address, indicating that they will purchase the book in the future when it's ready. That's a form of traction. Forms of bad traction are vanity metrics, right? Like people clicking like on a Facebook post. That's not a good form of traction because it doesn't tie in directly to revenue. So when you are actually showing progress to the people above you, you want to focus on traction. You don't want to focus on success theater or vanity metrics and things that don't actually indicate that this is going to be a successful business model. You want to be honest and focused on the things that do. So traction is the goal, is the fifth mindset, and that's directly tied into the next mindset, which is give yourself permission to scale, especially with new products, especially with new businesses, right? How do you get here? Everybody wants that hockey stick, the hockey stick curve, right? But you can't get here without first going here, without first going here. And this process has stages. You probably recognize some of these names, right? But giving yourself that permission to say, okay, we're not trying to get 1 million customers right now. We're not even trying to get 100,000. We're not even trying to get 10,000. We're trying to get 1,000, right? You're trying to give yourself permission to scale because the things that you do are going to be geared towards your next goal. And your next goal needs to be a certain point on this traction map. And this is what we call a traction roadmap. All right? This is the third lightweight tool that we use in continuous innovation. The first one was the lean canvas. That is to communicate your business idea clearly. The second tool was that customer factory, to show the progress of your business, right? To show the metrics, the high-level macro metrics. The third is this, the traction roadmap. And I just kind of want to walk you through this. I know it's a little busy on this screen, so let me just walk you through it. A traction roadmap, the first thing you do, you say, what is the minimum success requirement? 3 years in the future. The minimum revenue amount is usually what you talk about. The minimum annual recurring revenue that we need to make on this project in 3 years' time that would make this project a success. $10 million annual recurring revenue. That's the example being used here. From that, you say to yourself, well, what's the lifetime value of a customer based on our initial pricing? And you come up with the number of customers that you need every single year to reach that number. In this example, sorry, it's a little small, but in this example, it's 33,000 customers, right? Now you have the end goal in mind. And this is what you can show to stakeholders to really help them understand, oh, okay, this is what they need to get to. They're starting with this assumption that they can get 33,000 customers. It helps to show them, well, what's the size of the market? That could also very much help, right? If 33,000 customers is 50% of the addressable market, this is not going to work, right? And that's why building this traction roadmap early in the process of modeling your business idea helps you sanity check the business model. From that 33,000, from that goal, you have this mindset, 10x. This mindset is going to help you actually set your next goals and what you're working on your sprint. So 10x, 1/10 of 33,000, 3,300, 1/10 of that, 300. 1/10 of that is something down here, 30, right? And whenever you're setting your next validation plan, I know that's a new word for you, so don't worry about it too much, but whenever you're setting your next 3-month plan, your plan has a goal. Your goal is always traction. Your traction goal is always the next level up on this traction roadmap. If you're right here and you have, 100 customers, your next goal is this, 334 customers. And everything that you do, all of your sprints are geared towards that traction goal. If you're right here, if you have 500 customers, your next traction goal is 3,300 customers. And that goal setting helps you form this mindset of 10x. It helps your team think, how can we grow from 500 to 3,000, right? How can we go from 4,000 to 33,000, right? You don't want to overwhelm yourself when you only have 100 customers and say, we need 33,000, right? No, you need 300 next. Okay, so that's what the purpose of the traction roadmap is. It helps you sanity check your business model early on. Is this viable? Is 33,000 customers viable in this market? But then also it helps you set goals during your sprints. So startups often die because they don't find enough customers, but companies die because they stop talking to customers. They stop engaging them continuously. With continuous innovation, it is a mindset change, and you need to be prepared to get outside of your comfort zone when you start to propose this to your senior level staff, to your executives, and when you start to implement it. And I want to just take a picture from the early days of Agile. This is a stand-up for Agile back in the 90s. This might have been uncomfortable for people to do, but it is just a new way of thinking, a new way of doing things, right? You're not micromanaging anybody, but you're actually helping them with the mindsets that they need to do continuous innovation, and some of the mindsets that we talked about here today. So, anyways, you can kind of see this today, just like the early days of Agile, today is the early days of continuous innovation. It's a new way of doing things, and being able to, first of all, get buy-in. I can hear Kathy and Miranda, you both are thinking, well, how do I get buy-in for this? Well, certainly you need to have a discussion with executives and outline some of the things that we've talked about, but also outline and understand how, if we keep doing the things that we've been doing, we're going to keep getting the things that we've gotten. And being able to break away and getting acceptance and buy-in for a new way of doing things, and even just testing it but you need to give yourself, time. Don't just say test it for 1 month. You need to give 6 months just to start showing progress and traction on a couple business models. That's what's really going to get real buy-in. I'm happy to actually help if you'd like to kind of talk about how best to present this to executives to get their buy-in, because I've recently had to do that myself, and I can certainly help with that. Thank you very much.